Yeah, I mean, if you just look at the numbers, for example, at Harvard, and I can show them to you afterward, the average scores that were required to be admitted into higher education, Ivy League schools, with Asian Americans it was 1350, with white Americans it was 1310, with black Americans it was 1100. So an Asian American female student would, on average, be required to have a higher SAT score and higher performative metrics academically than a white male. These are the consequences of affirmative action. Affirmative action has harmed black Americans, let alone Asian Americans, in trying to right the racial discriminations of the past. And that's why I think we need to do away with it. I think we need to do away with it and stop focusing on viewing everyone through the prism of lens and view them through the prism of intellectual diversity and performative contributions. I think that would be fair to Asian Americans. I think it would be fair to black Americans. And I think it's the right thing to do.
This is a classic bait and switch. He's calling it affirmative action. What he really has a problem with is the admissions policies at Ivy League schools. His followers won't know the difference, but I'm willing to bet he does. His followers most likely believe in one of the go-to white supremacist talking points, that blacks are getting undeserved benefits and usually taking it from whites. His take on affirmative action is confirming their belief. This is a common tactic to talk about affirmative action without actually talking about affirmative action, all the while giving his followers ammo, or what they would think would be ammo, against affirmative action. Affirmative action, by the way, actual affirmative action, does help black people in a system of white supremacy. To understand the bait and switch, we have to give a little context. First, affirmative action is a practice that started with the Department of Labor in the 1960s. Notice, he's not talking about the Department of Labor, he's talking about and giving statistics on the admissions policies at Ivy League schools. Affirmative action is a set of guidelines intended to address historical and ongoing discrimination against marginalized and underrepresented groups. This was in the Department of Labor. This had to do with the hiring of government contractors. They are guidelines. They are not laws. Companies started to follow suit and implemented affirmative action strategies based on those guidelines into their business. They used the guidelines to set up their own policies. That's in the employment realm. In the education realm, which is what the guy in the video is talking about, colleges and universities did the same thing. Let me put that into context. After the affirmative action guidelines in the 1960s, up until 1978, colleges and universities could set their own admissions policy how they saw fit. They allotted a specific number of slots for different racial groups. Some of those slots could be given based solely on race. After 1978, colleges and universities were allowed to consider race as part of their admissions decision, but no longer permitted to make decisions exclusively on race. For further context, the Supreme Court just ruled that colleges and universities could not consider race at all in admissions. So, these were policies that were set up for admissions guidelines for entry into a college or university. Now, when he says that,
yeah, I mean, if you just look at the numbers, for example, at Harvard, and I can show them to you afterward, the average scores that were required to be admitted into higher education, Ivy League schools, with Asian Americans it was 1350, with white Americans it was 1310, with black Americans it was 1100.
He's talking about SAT scores. SAT scores have been widely criticized for their cultural bias, socioeconomic factors, and test-taking standards. Whether we believe that's the case or not is irrelevant. The admissions at these Ivy League schools believe that was the case about SATs. Because of the potential problems SAT scores had, this wasn't a representation of the full picture of a potential student, or so they thought. And since they set their own standards on admissions, conventional wisdom would suggest that they literally figured that into their admissions equation. Being, if you are not a member of a systematically deprived economic group, you are more likely to have access to the best schools, the best tutors, the best teachers, the best study guides, the best classes, not to mention being able to afford to take the test as many times as you want. Again, conventional wisdom would suggest students with access to these tools should perform better on the SAT than someone who didn't have those built-in advantages. It was an acknowledgement of the wrongs done by the system of white supremacy. So again, when he says that,
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at the numbers, for example, at Harvard, and I can show them to you afterward, the average scores that were required to be admitted into higher education, Ivy League schools, with Asian Americans it was 1350, with white Americans it was 1310, with black Americans it was 1100.
That's the context behind it. Now, since we know affirmative action is a guideline set for the Department of Labor for its government contractors, and different forms of those guidelines were adopted by private companies, colleges, and universities, we can get into the depravity of what he's actually saying. He keeps saying affirmative action, then tells his followers that affirmative action is bad. This will have the intended consequences that when his followers hear affirmative action, they're going to want it gone. In the system of white supremacy, where laws, standards, and practices were used to keep the wealth disproportionately in the hands of white people, the majority of black people who need employment would have to go to white-owned companies. It only makes sense. White-owned companies have affirmative action policies in place to counteract implicit racial bias. It's known, people without guidelines or policies to follow, they tend to hire people that look like them. They tend to give people who look like them more chances. This is indisputable in any honest way. This is actual affirmative action to seek out, recruit, and advance qualified candidates for a more diverse, wealth-building workforce. This helps black people in this country. This is a practice of affirmative action that he actually wants gone. This is the affirmative action his followers will be motivated to stop. He attacked the Ivy League's admissions policy that he claimed was affirmative action, when in reality, it was a policy loosely based on the affirmative action guidelines. We have to be mindful, the bait and switch tactic of white supremacy.